This year, four American tech giants are on track to pour about $650 billion into AI infrastructure. That number is staggering. But the most important AI story in the world may not be who spends the most on data centers. It may be whether China can use cheaper models, open source distribution, domestic chips, and humanoid robotics to turn second place in frontier models into first place in physical deployment. That is where the race starts looking very different. That is the real shape of the AI war in 2026. The United States still leads at the technological frontier, especially in compute scale and model performance. China, by contrast, is advancing through efficiency gains, open source diffusion, and deep integration of AI into the real economy. Those are not two versions of the same strategy. They are two different theories of how power will be built. And that distinction matters because too much of the public conversation still treats the AI race like a single scoreboard. Bigger model, bigger cluster, bigger valuation. End of story. But Kyle Chan told the House Select Committee last week that the competition spans compute, models, adoption, integration, and deployment. If that framework is right, then raw model rankings alone are not enough to tell you who is actually winning. The scoreboard is wider than most people think. If you want clear, fast breakdowns of the power shifts shaping the world, subscribe to Signal Drop now. Because this AI race is not just about smarter models, it is about who builds the stronger system around them. The American side of this contest is clear enough. Reuters reported that Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, and Microsoft are expected to invest about $650 billion in AI-related infrastructure this year, up sharply from $410 billion in 2025. That scale is hard to overstate. It is a private sector build-out so large that it is starting to affect chip supply, power demand, capital markets, and investor nerves all at once. This is no longer a software boom. It is an industrial positioning campaign. The company-level numbers show why Wall Street is treating this like a new industrial cycle rather than a normal software boom. Alphabet told investors it expects 2026 capex of $175 billion to $185 billion. Reuters reported Amazon is projecting about $200 billion. Reuters also reported Meta expects 2026 capital expenditures of $115 billion to $135 billion. Microsoft has not published a comparable full-year figure, but Reuters reported it spent $37.5 billion in a single quarter and has spent more than $200 billion on AI since the start of fiscal 2024. That is not experimentation. That is strategic scale. That is the U.S. bet in one sentence. If compute demand keeps outpacing supply, then the companies that lock up the most chips, the most power, the most data center capacity, and the strongest model pipelines should keep the edge. Reuters reported that ASML and TSMC are still seeing strong demand from American cloud giants, which is one reason the AI spending boom looks intact, despite all the bubble talk. If compute remains the decisive bottleneck, America's logic still holds. The Chinese side starts from a different position. Chan's testimony says China's top AI models still lag American frontier models by several months or more, and that U.S. models maintain a clear lead in overall performance across a wide range of benchmarks. That is the first fact to keep straight. The United States is still ahead at the model frontier. The real question is what China does with the gap. And the answer, increasingly, is adaptation rather than imitation. China is not trying to outspend the US hyperscalers dollar for dollar in the same way. It is pursuing a more asymmetric path. Squeeze more usable capability out of constrained hardware. Spread models as widely as possible through open weights. Push AI into industrial and robotic systems where deployment can create a different kind of advantage. That is not copying the American playbook. It is building around its own constraints. Start with efficiency. Brookings notes that Chinese labs have leaned heavily on mixture of experts architectures and on techniques such as DeepSeek, sparse attention to reduce computation and memory costs. It also says Chinese firms are pushing quantization aggressively, including 4-bit approaches in the Quen family and INT4 deployment in Moonshot AI's Kimi K2 thinking. That is not just clever engineering, it is strategy shaped by constraint. Chan's testimony makes the logic even clearer. He says this push toward greater efficiency is far more central for Chinese labs, largely out of necessity. U.S. companies also work on low-precision formats, but they do so from a position of greater compute abundance. China is doing it because export controls and supply limits make waste a luxury it cannot afford. Pressure is forcing discipline, and discipline is becoming innovation. That is why DeepSeek mattered so much. Reuters reported in February that the industry was stunned when DeepSeek broke through with a strong model despite U.S. export controls restricting access to advanced semiconductors. The point was not that China had suddenly overtaken the United States. The point was that Chinese labs had shown they could still generate disruptive performance gains under pressure. That changes how the whole competition has to be read. And the response did not stop there. Reuters reported this month that DeepSeek's coming V4 model is expected to run on Huawei chips, with Chinese tech giants reportedly placing large orders for Huawei's upcoming AI processors. Reuters also reported that DeepSeek has been working directly with Huawei and Cambricon to rewrite parts of the model stack for Chinese chips. So the adaptation is now happening at both the model level and the hardware level. That is a more serious kind of resilience. That matters because the U.S. strategy assumes chip denial creates a durable ceiling on China's progress. It certainly creates friction. But Reuters reported on April 1st that Chinese vendors captured nearly 41% of China's AI accelerator server market in 2025, with Huawei alone shipping roughly 812,000 AI chips. That does not erase the U.S. lead in advanced semiconductors. It does show that substitution is happening faster than Washington would prefer. Delayed is not the same as frozen. Now add the second Chinese advantage, open source diffusion. Brookings says many Chinese AI firms release open-weight models with detailed technical reports, making them easy for developers to download, adapt, and deploy on their own infrastructure. Most top American AI models, by contrast, remain closed and accessible mainly through paid subscriptions or APIs. That gives U.S. firms stronger direct monetization. It also gives China a wider channel for global spread. And this is where the scoreboard starts to break. That diffusion is already showing up in real usage. Chan's testimony says Chinese models have surpassed U.S. counterparts in total downloads on platforms like Hugging Face, and that derivative models built on Chinese foundations have outpaced those built on American ones. It also says Meta's Llama family has been overtaken in popularity by Alibaba's Quen. That is not the frontier race, it is the adoption race. And it matters because adoption shapes the ecosystem underneath the frontier. Reuters put the warning in even sharper terms last month. Citing a report from a U.S. advisory body, it said some estimates suggest around 80% of U.S. AI startups now use Chinese open-source AI models. It also reported that Quen has surpassed Llama in cumulative downloads and that DeepSeek's R1 model briefly overtook ChatGPT as the most downloaded model on the U.S. App Store. Those signals do not prove U.S. firms are losing the frontier. They do show China is winning distribution channels that shape the ecosystem underneath it. That is not a side battle. It is one of the main ones. That is the first big contradiction in this story. America's strongest AI companies are building the most expensive and powerful systems, but many of the models spreading most quickly through developer communities are coming out of China. One side is maximizing performance and monetization. The other is maximizing diffusion and optionality. Those are very different ways to build influence. And once diffusion matters, the contest stops being only about labs. So which matters more in this race right now, frontier performance or mass deployment? Drop models. If you think the US lead at the frontier still decides everything, or deployment if you think China is winning where AI actually spreads. If you want the simplest way to read the American approach, it is capital supremacy. Scale the clusters, secure the supply chain, raise the model frontier, trust that product revenues and platform control will justify the spend later. Reuters reported that investors are already questioning whether returns will come fast enough, but the spending keeps rising anyway because the companies believe compute scarcity is still the decisive bottleneck. There are early signs that monetization is beginning to show up, though unevenly. Reuters reported that Amazon's AI services business is now generating an annualized revenue run rate of more than $15 billion, while its custom chip business has crossed a $20 billion annualized run rate. Reuters also noted that Microsoft previously disclosed its AI business had crossed a $13 billion annual run rate in late 2024. These numbers do not settle the CapEx debate, but they do show the spending is not completely detached from revenue. Still, monetization is not the same as strategic victory. A company can sell a lot of AI services and still lose a broader ecosystem battle if developers, manufacturers, and foreign governments build their stacks on someone else's open models. That is why Brookings argues the US-China AI race is not one contest but several. The frontier model war and the adoption war can point in different directions at the same time. That is where the story gets bigger than cloud margins. Now comes the third track, and this is where the story gets really interesting: physical integration. China's 2026 government work report says it will advance and expand the AI Plus initiative, promote faster application of intelligent terminals and AI agents, encourage large-scale commercial application in key sectors, support open-source AI communities, and build new hyperscale computing infrastructure coordinated with electricity supply. That is not a narrow software agenda. It is industrial policy, and this is where software starts turning into power. Chan's testimony says embodied AI and robotics are a key priority for Chinese policymakers. It points to more than 5,000 humanoid robots manufactured last year by Unitree, local government labs collecting robotics training data from human operators, and experimentation by Chinese electric vehicle makers using humanoids on assembly lines. In other words, Beijing is not just funding models, it is trying to fuse AI with the physical economy. That is a very different endgame. Reuters reporting from this week shows what that push looks like in public. More than 300 humanoid robots were set to take part in China's second robot half marathon, with nearly 40% navigating autonomously. Reuters also reported that China accounted for more than 80% of the world's 16,000 humanoid robot installations in 2025, according to Counterpoint Research, and that domestic leaders Agibot and Unitree each shipped more than 5,000 units last year. That is a serious manufacturing signal, even if the commercial case is still immature. The spectacle is not the whole story, the scale signal is. The symbolism here matters. The United States has the stronger frontier models and the deeper private capital pool. China is trying to become the place where AI gets bodies, wheels, factory placements, and mass deployment routines. If the next stage of AI competition shifts from chat and coding toward autonomous systems, industrial robots, logistics, and machine vision in the real economy, then the balance of advantage may look different than it does on benchmark charts. That is where the map starts to change. That does not mean China has solved embodied AI. Reuters is explicit that the industry remains in its infancy, that many robots still serve research or entertainment functions, and that firms are struggling with dexterity, perception, and software quality. One startup founder quoted by Reuters said bluntly that much of the current display is dancing disguised as working. That line lands because it captures the risk of reading spectacle as maturity, and that risk is real. But immaturity is not irrelevance. Early industrial revolutions often look clumsy before they look inevitable. Reuters reported that UB Tech had fewer than 10 humanoids in factories in 2024 and more than 1,000 last year. It also reported that firms are pouring resources into real-world data collection by fitting human workers with sensors and deploying more robots to factory floors. That is how an experimental category starts becoming a learning system. Messy first, useful later. This is the second major contradiction in the AI war. America is spending more on compute than anyone else, but China may be building a stronger bridge from AI models into factories, robotics, and the supply chains of physical production. One side is stronger in intelligence generation, the other may be getting better at intelligence embodiment. In the long run, both matter. But if the physical economy becomes the decisive battlefield, this distinction gets much bigger. There is also a political economy angle the US cannot ignore. Brookings argues China can leverage adjacent strengths in electric vehicles, batteries, sensors, smartphones, and large-scale manufacturing as overlaps with robotic supply chains. That is a structural advantage America's software giants do not naturally possess to the same degree. Data centers and chips are critical, but so is the industrial ecosystem that turns AI into machines at scale. The American response so far has mostly doubled down on the frontier. That makes sense. The US still has the leading model labs, the biggest cloud platforms, top-end chip design, and access to global capital deep enough to finance a capex cycle that Reuters says could exceed $600 billion this year. If you believe the decisive bottleneck is compute, then the US strategy remains rational. It is not irrational, it is selective. But if you believe the decisive bottleneck is translation from models into broad economic deployment, then the picture gets murkier. Brookings says the long-run winner will be determined not simply by who builds the most powerful models, but by who can most effectively translate AI into broad-based economic and societal gains. That shifts the frame from laboratory power to system power, and once you make that shift, the scoreboard looks different again. That is exactly why China's open-source posture matters so much. Open models lower the cost of experimentation. They allow developers, firms, and local governments to customize systems quickly. They also make it easier to push models into local hardware and specialized workflows. US firms earn more from closed models, but China may be building wider downstream optionality because more people can actually use its tools. Breadth matters when ecosystems compound. The chip story reinforces that. Export controls have clearly slowed China and preserved US advantage at the frontier. But Reuters reporting on Huawei, Cambricon, and the broader Chinese accelerator market suggests the controls are also pushing China towards substitution, domestic procurement, and tighter integration between model labs and local chip suppliers. Pressure is real. So is adaptation, and adaptation can become a strategy of its own. There is a lesson in that for Washington. Containment strategies can buy time, but they also shape the innovation incentives of the targeted system. In China's case, those incentives appear to be producing more efficient models, stronger domestic chip ecosystems, more aggressive open-source diffusion, and a policy focus on embodied AI. That does not mean the controls failed. It means they are changing the form of competition, not freezing it. That is a very different outcome. There is a lesson here for investors too. Much of Wall Street still talks about AI as if the biggest question is whether American hyperscaler spending will earn an acceptable return. That is a valid question. Reuters has reported plenty of skepticism on that front. But the strategic question is larger. What if some of the returns to AI are captured not only in software revenues, but in industrial leverage, open-source dependence, and physical deployment ecosystems that do not show up neatly on quarterly cloud margins? That is where the spreadsheet starts missing the battlefield. Here is the clearest analytical payoff. The United States is trying to dominate the brains of AI. China is trying to close the gap in brains while building a lead in arms, legs, and factory floor integration. If that sounds simplistic, good. Simplicity is useful here, because once you see the competition that way, a lot of seemingly unrelated facts suddenly line up. And this is where the two tracks become impossible to ignore. The US side lines up as compute scale, closed commercial models, high capex, and strong frontier performance. The China side lines up as efficiency engineering, open weight diffusion, domestic chip substitution, AI plus industrial policy, and embodied AI. Neither model is complete. Both carry serious risks, but they are no longer just variations of the same plan. They are diverging national operating systems for AI, and whoever makes the stronger system, not just the stronger demo, may end up ahead. If you want proof that the divergence is already influencing policy, look at Washington's own warnings. Reuters reported that a U.S. advisory body warned China's open source dominance could threaten the American lead, especially as AI shifts toward agentic and embodied systems. That warning is telling. It means the concern in Washington is no longer only about benchmark scores or frontier labs. It is about ecosystem lock-in, and ecosystem lock-in is much harder to reverse once it spreads. If you want proof that the divergence is influencing markets, look at the spending discipline debate. Reuters reported that investors punished or questioned several big tech names as AI spending surged, even while ASML and TSMC signaled the chip demand boom remains robust. The market is caught between two stories at once: AI as the next great productivity engine, and AI as the next great capital sink. That tension is not going away anytime soon. If this breakdown is helping you see the race more clearly, subscribe to Signal Drop and drop 2 tracks in the comments. Because the next few years may not be decided only by who launches the smartest model, but by who turns AI into the more durable economic system around it. There are obvious ways this can go wrong for China. Open source reach does not automatically create profit. Domestic chips still lag at the high end. Reuters reports that many humanoids remain years away from broad industrial deployment. And if embodied AI hype outruns actual utility, Beijing could end up with a lot of demonstrations and not enough productivity. Those are real risks, and they matter. There are obvious ways this can go wrong for the United States, too. CapEx at this scale can create bottlenecks in power, chips, and data center construction, while raising investor pressure for returns that may arrive more slowly than the spending curve. Reuters reported that the AI boom has entered a more dangerous phase precisely because compute demand still outpaces supply, and the downside gets bigger if anything breaks. Scale is an advantage. It is also a vulnerability if the payoff arrives too late. So what should we watch next? First, whether the U.S. frontier lead stays wide or narrows. Chan's testimony says China still trails by months, not years, and that matters. A months-long gap is meaningful, but it is not an insurmountable civilizational divide. If Chinese efficiency gains keep compounding while frontier scaling gets more expensive, that gap could matter differently over time. Second, watch open source adoption, not just proprietary model revenues. If Chinese open models keep outperforming U.S. counterparts in downloads, developer adoption, and derivative ecosystems, then America's frontier lead could coexist with a broader loss of distribution power. That would be a strategically awkward outcome, inventing the best systems while losing some of the channels through which the world actually uses them. That is not impossible anymore. Third, watch physical deployment. The question is not whether a robot can run a race in Beijing. Reuters is right to caution against reading too much into that. The real question is whether China can move from spectacle to factory usefulness, from research pilots to repeated workflows, and from demonstration units to deployed fleets that generate data, lower costs, and improve the next generation of embodied AI. That is where theater ends and leverage begins. That is the real meaning of the two-track AI war in 2026. The United States is trying to own the highest ground in intelligence itself. China is trying to make sure intelligence does not stay trapped in the cloud. Whoever can combine those strengths most effectively will shape not just the next software cycle, but the operating system of the physical economy.